Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. Courtship of Captain Miles Standish, a true historical narrative, by Moses Mullins, 1672. About this rather singular production, a word or two may seem to be necessary. Whether it be really a genuine antique or a more modern imitation is a question for critics to discuss. We can only throw such light upon it as we happen to possess, and such as the document bears upon the face of it. This ballad has been transmitted to us by the editor of the late Boston Miscellany, which valuable monthly kicked the bucket, if we remember right, sometime in March last. Peace to its ashes. May the good it did live after it. If it ever did evil, it has not come to our knowledge. It certainly did not accomplish so much good as it would have done had its life been spared another month. For the said editor had his metrical passage in New England history all ready for the typesetter with an explanatory heading that ran thus: To render the following relic of primitive New England literature intelligible, the orthography has been modernized and a few words substituted at a guess for those which the mildew of age had effaced from the manuscript. For these unavoidable liberties we humbly crave the pardon of the good old Plymouth gentleman who drew the ballad from his family archives for our especial benefit. From this remark of the late editor of the Miscellany, no, not so. The editor of the late Miscellany, for it was the magazine that died, not the editor, we should infer that he had a strong faith in the antiquity of the ballad. But that editor is a simple-hearted, credulous man, as men of genius and refined taste are apt to be, and we confess that we cannot but regret that he did not procure the affidavit of the good old Plymouth gentleman touching the antiquity of the paper, stating how long it had been in his possession, and whether it actually came down to him from his ancestors. This would have been gratifying to us, and we think more satisfactory to the public. Were the editor here, we would persuade him now to write to his friend at Plymouth to procure the affidavit of the old gentleman. But, alas, he is away, nobody knows where, dodging about among the hills of New England, and were we to undertake to reach him by letter, we should not know whether to direct it to the Notch of the White Mountains or to the long hard beach at Nahant. So, at present, we can only give the document to the public with such evidence as we have. In order to ascertain whether the ballad was founded in truth, we have turned to some old New England chronicles and find that the whole story is historically true to the letter. Captain Miles Standish did come over in the Mayflower. His wife's name was Rose. Mr. John Alden and Mr. William Mullins were among the number that came over in the same vessel. Mr. William Mullins had a daughter whose name was Priscilla, and the main incident, according to the chronicles, actually occurred precisely as related in the poem. Ballad. Miles Standish in the Mayflower came across the stormy wave, and in that little band was none more generous or brave. Midst cold December's sleet and snow, on Plymouth Rock they land. Weak were their hands, but strong their hearts, that pious pilgrim band. Oh, sad it was in their poor huts to hear the storm winds blow, and terrible at midnight hour, when yelled the savage foe. And when the savage, grim and dire, his bloody work began, for a champion brave, I have been told, Miles Standish was the man. But oh, his heart was made to bow with grief and painful low, for sickness on the pilgrim band now dealt a dreadful blow. In arms of death so fast they fell, they scarce were buried, and his dear wife, whose name was Rose, was laid among the dead. His sorrow was not loud, but deep, for her he did bemoan, and such keen anguish wrung his heart, he could not live alone. Then to John Alden did he speak, John Alden was his friend, and said, Friend John, unto my wish, I pray thee now attend. My heart is sad, 'tis very sad, my poor wife Rose is gone, and in this wild and savage land I cannot live alone. To Mr. William Mullins then I wish you would repair, and see if he will give me leave to wed his daughter fair. Priscilla was the daughter's name, comely and fair was she, and kind of heart she was withal, as any maid could be. John Alden, to oblige his friend, straightway to Mullins went, and told his errand like a man, and asked for his consent. Now Mr. Mullins was a sire, quite rational and kind, and such consent would never give against his daughter's mind. He told John Alden if his child should be inclined that way, and Captain Standish was her choice, he had no more to say. He then called in his daughter dear, and straightway did retire, that she might with more freedom speak, in absence of her sire. John Alden had a bright blue eye, and was a handsome man, and when he spoke, a pleasant look o'er all his features ran. He rose, and in a courteous way his errand did declare, and said, Fair maid, what word shall I to Captain Standish bear? Warm blushes glowed upon the cheeks of that fair maiden then. At first she turned away her eyes, then looked at John again. And then, with downcast modest mien, she said with trembling tone, Now prithee, John, why dost thou not speak for thyself alone? Deep red then grew John Alden's face, he bade the maid good-bye, but while she read, before he went, the language in his eye. No matter what the language said, which in that eye was rife, in one short month Priscilla was John Alden's loving wife. End of section 1. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. Just 15 by S.D.G. of Maysville, Kentucky. We always did love to do the sweet ladies justice. They are capable of making themselves so dear to us, and are such fair flowers blossoming on the rude pathway of man's existence. For this simple reason do we take pleasure in transferring to the pages of the Rover the following pretty story from the Western Star. We like it, for it brings before our own vision a shadowy picture of the past, long ago, when we were just 15, not so very long either. It minds us of the old schoolhouse upon the green, of our merry companions. Alas, where are they now? All scattered, many dead, none as they then were, so happy, so free of care and corroding thought. Oh, it makes us melancholy to think of those bygone days, just 15. Why, yes, the very time to get in love, for there is no bitter than to pour into our cup of sweets. There is no discord to mar the harmony of our spiritual music. The idol which we have placed in the temple of our worship had no unjust proportions to offend the delicacy of our conception, and like immortal Paris, we go to our rosy slumbers but to associate in dreamy enchantment with the sweet object of our young affections. Like a gay butterfly just burst from its chrysalis, we revel in ecstasies in the new world we have found, where all seems joy and sunshine. In memory of these things do we like just 15. It makes us a boy again. See, there's Effie Duncan. Look at our plate. Sweet Effie. We will wager our goose quill, and we value it not lightly, that our author is an authoress, for we see her heart pictured all through the story. We will hear from her, and she will confess herself a woman. She will not need a mirror, for the glassy streams of her own beautiful valleys will reflect the likeness of her form and features, though the fates forbid that, like Narcissus, she fall in love with her own shadow, and pine away into a daffodil. We met the flower which we call, blooming in the wilderness, and with care have we transplanted it to a warmer clime, and given it as companions the rich and rare. May we not hope for this occasionally to receive from the same unknown source fresh flowers of exceeding beauty from the wide west, and that another's hand will not be unserviceable in roaming through the mazy paths of literature. L.L. Just 15 by S.D.G. of Maysville, Kentucky. They were just 15, those young lovers, and the golden autumn sunlight falling with so mellow and rich a radiance over their perfect forms and eloquent countenances gave to their appearance an air of yet more extreme youth and childishness than really belonged to them. They were just 15, Rupert Clare and Effie Duncan, yet who that beheld the boy's bold, earnest manner, his long, passionate gaze upon the fair face before him, the eager, eloquent words that fell from his lips, and the flash of excited feeling that glowed on his cheek, who that saw all this, together with the tight clasp of his hand on the fair one that trembled in his own, who, I say, would have believed they were just 15? They were just 15, mere children in age and also in form, yet what could be the theme that had power to stain the soft cheek of Effie Duncan with so deep a crimson, and make her tremble before that youth's earnest eye, as the aspen leaf trembles in the summer breeze? They stood by the river bank in the soft radiant sunlight, Effie's bonnet lying on the grass where it had fallen, and her light glittering ringlets unconfined by comb or band, for she was just 15, and of course could not be considered old enough for a woman, sweeping in graceful luxuriance over her snowy neck and shoulders, one hand resting in the clasp of the eager youth, and her clear bright eye roving away over the water as if in expectation of some coming object. "You need not fear his return yet," said the boy, as he marked that uneasy and restless glance along the surface of the stream that flowed in quiet majesty by them. "I think there is no danger of his immediate return, and you need not fear to trust yourself alone with me for a few minutes at least," he added with some bitterness in his tone, and at the same moment releasing her hand so eagerly retained in his own till now. The girl made no reply, and he continued, "You would not be so chary of your time with Dudley, Allen, and he does not love you as I do either. But his father is rich. I am a poor boy." Effie still did not speak, but she raised her clear, tearful eyes to his face, and taking the hand he had withdrawn, she pressed it silently and convulsively to her lips, as if by that mute, appealing eloquence alone she might convince him how deeply his thoughts wronged her. Rupert drew her passionately to his bosom, acknowledged his injustice with bold and generous frankness, and would have kissed away her tears from her cheek with all the gallantry of 25. But the girl drew back, while the color of her cheek grew yet deeper at every word the noble boy uttered, and at every pressure of his hand on her own. "But to resume our first subject," said the youth, at length taking up the thread of their original discourse. "When I am gone, Effie, you will no longer love me as you love now. My presence will be wanting to remind you of the past, and in a few months, perhaps weeks, you will forget that such a being as Rupert Clare ever whispered love to you, and received from your own sweet lips the yet sweeter and dearer assurance that you too loved and loved him." "I thought it was man's province to forget," said Effie, stooping down to cull a wild flower that grew close by her side, and holding it up before him with a half smile, she continued, "Do you see this flower? They tell me that flowers are meet emblems of the constancy of your volatile sex. If so, how long, Rupert, will your affection for me last, until you see some newer and lovelier face?" "Keep the flower, dear Effie, till we meet again," said the youth, returning it to her. "Keep it till we meet, and although it may be withered and scentless ere then, yet with tender care and gentle handling like your own, you will see that it will retain much of its early bloom and beauty. Even so it is with me. Long before we meet again, the freshness and vigor of youth may be gone from me, but the heart, oh, never will the heart lose its warm feeling of truth and affection, never will its gushing springs of early love become dry beneath the wasting and arid influence of the cold and reckless world. Never will I live to say, I cannot feel now as I felt once. My heart has grown hard in the world's ways, and I'm no longer what I have been. No, no, rather let me die than outlive the youth of my heart." And these were the words, and these the sentiments of 15. Alas, young dreamer, you little know the world and the world's ways. You little know how it changes everything that comes within its blighting influence, and the heart above all things. Well, I have escaped so far, perhaps you may also. "And you will not forget me," said the girl, blushing at her own boldness. "Never, never," replied the boy, with an energy that carried conviction with it. "And if my father should use force to compel me to marry Dudley Allen?" asked the girl irresolutely. Rupert Clare bent the slight cane he held in his hand until it almost snapped beneath his weight. Light as it was, his flushed cheek and burning brow were answer enough. They said more than words could say. Rupert is gone to college, and 6 months have passed away since the lovers of 15 last saw each other. Beside the river bank, and almost on the very spot where she parted with Rupert Clare, Effie Duncan is again seated, engaged in the sportive and everyday employment of angling in the stream, whose quiet waters never glassed a finer form or lovelier face than is now reflected on the clear mirror of its peaceful bosom. Near her stood a gentleman whose strikingly handsome features bore so strong a resemblance to the fair girl's as to leave little doubt of the relation in which they stood to each other. "Who do you love best in all the world, Effie?" asked her father, breaking a long silence, as he threw his hook into the glittering waters, after an unsuccessful attempt to obtain a fine perch that had for some time been playing with his patience. "Who do you love the best, Effie?" "My father and mother," replied the girl, affecting to be busy in baiting her hook, which, however, needed no replenishing, as Mr. Duncan might easily have perceived, and perhaps did perceive. "My father and mother, of course." "You are a very dutiful daughter, I know," said Mr. Duncan with provoking calmness, "but I did not allude to your parents, or indeed to any of your relations. There is a love entirely different from the love of kindred, and it was this passion to which I had reference when I asked the question." "I'm too young to love," replied Effie, stooping down over the water to hide the conscious blush that mantled to her very temples. "I'm too young to love. You forget that I am just 15 years old." "And 6 months," added her father coolly, and he continued smilingly, "I've known persons to love even younger than 15, Effie, and according to modern rule, women are decided old maids at 22, so I thought it advisable to remind you of the necessity that would ultimately compel you to choose a partner from among the many of your rural admirers that generally throng my parlor on Sundays, and not the least devoted in his attention among them all is Dudley Allen. as I have observed with much pleasure. 2. For though much your senior, Dudley is a young man of excellent heart and principles, and he wrote to me this morning on the subject, begging permission to visit my house, and entreating my intercession with you in his favour. Can you make up your mind to look upon him as your future husband if I tell you it is my wish for you to do so? I can, replied Effie with mournful resolution, and in a firm, steady voice, nor did her looks quail under the keen, searching, brilliant eye that her father bent on her during his quest, and her answer. But when, after he had kissed and blessed her for the ready obedience she showed to his wishes, Effie looked around on the scene that before lay smiling in all the fresh and glowing loveliness of early spring, it seemed to her as if the beauty had suddenly faded from every object, and a dark shadow had fallen over all that but now had appeared so glorious and so bright to the partial gaze of affection. Alas, sweet Effie, the shadow was on thine own heart, and not on the outward world. How short a time may suffice to work a change in the human heart, that weeks, days, and even years, under ordinary circumstances, would fail to effect. How slight a word will sometimes do what at some others, ages, yes, ages, could never accomplish. Effie was no longer a child. It seemed as if that moment and that command, and the necessity for exertion that it enforced, called forth powers and a strength of mind and principle that she was herself not aware of possessing. And it was with a calm, collected air, and a step of unfaltering firmness that she followed her father to the house where she expected to find the dreaded Dudley Allen. True to his time, Dudley came, and after a long conversation with Mr. Duncan in his study, he sought Effie, whose heart sunk within her as she saw him, though she met him with a coolness and self-possession that surprised even herself. He made no allusion, however, to the subject of his suit, nor did his demeanour toward her differ from its accustomed tone in the slightest degree, and several days passed away before Dudley alluded to his hopes and the subject of his discourse with Mr. Duncan, and then it was with so much delicacy and gentle regard for her feelings that Effie listened to him with far less repugnance than she had anticipated. But still the image of Rupert Clare was ever in her heart, growing with her growth, and strengthening with her strength. It served to check her admiration of the noble qualities of Dudley Allen, to pale her cheek when he spoke to her of love in love's sweetest language, and to dampen the esteem and friendship that as anything but a lover she would willingly have entertained for him. Often, too often for Dudley's hopes, alas, the little flower Rupert had requested her to retain was bathed in tears of hopeless affection and anguish, tears no human eye might see, but all the more bitter that the pang which caused them to flow must be concealed within the depths of her own silent heart. At length the time for the marriage was decided on, and Mr. Duncan wrote to require the presence of Rupert Clare at the joyful festival. The letter found the young student in a gay company of collegians, and never dreaming of its contents being otherwise than pleasant, he hastily broke the seal and read the words that struck like a death-bolt to his heart. No sign of emotion escaped him, however, save that his cheek became deadly pale, and his lip slightly quivered with an expression of extreme pain. "What is the matter, Clare? Any ill news in your letter, for you look very pale?" asked one of his companions, whose eyes detected the change in Rupert's countenance. "Nothing, no ill news whatever, only a passing chill," replied Rupert, passing his hand over his forehead, as if to dispel some cloud from his vision. The company shortly after broke up, and Rupert prepared with a heavy heart to obey the request of Mr. Duncan, his guardian. He arrived at home 2 days before the one destined to seal his own misery, determined, if possible, to avoid all communion with Effie, and to act toward her with all the haughty indifference that his noble but haughty spirit could command. His firmness almost gave way, however, when he saw her so changed, so mournful and so sad, and although she smiled as she gave him her hand, it was a strange, joyless, furtive smile which almost raised the ungenerous hope in his own bosom that she could not be, was not happy in her choice. He was strolling through the garden on the last evening before the bridal, endeavoring to call to his aid in the coming trial to his feelings a sufficient degree of moral resolution to enable him to bear up boldly, at least in the eyes of others, and of all others those of Effie herself, when he was roused by a slight rustling of leaves close by, and the next instant the girl stood before him, pale, trembling, and affrighted, though evidently from her looks expecting to see and meet with him. Rupert would have turned away, but Effie caught his arm, exclaiming hastily and in a trembling voice, "Only one moment. I will detain you but a moment, Rupert." The youth paused and stood silently and proudly beside her, awaiting her next words, with bent head and an air of respectful and dignified attention that stung the girl to the very soul. A moment before, and she would have explained all, everything, and confessed to him how little her heart was in the approaching marriage. Now she was as cold as Rupert himself, as proud and as self-possessed, and drawing back for him to pass on, and calmly saying, "I did wish to make some explanations to you, but I will not detain you." She walked slowly and resolutely away, leaving Rupert to curse his wayward folly and the imperious pride that had influenced his conduct. He would have followed, and entreated her to hear him, to pity, to forgive, and ever to regard him as a friend, if he could be no more to her. But that same pride forbade the humiliation until the garden gate closed after her, and then, just as he bounded forward to obey the impulse of his heart and join her, he saw Dudley Allen, radiant with hope and happiness, spring to her side, and the bitter jealousy of Rupert could easily interpret the meaning of the flowing words that caused Effie to turn away her burning cheek from the admiring gaze of her lover. It was enough, more than enough, for it did not need that he should see the girl voluntarily present her hand to his rival, to be covered with such passionate kisses at what he could fully comprehend as some earnest assurance from Effie herself, to send the sting of anguish yet deeper into his heart. It was enough, and sick of all he saw, the world and himself also, the lover of 15 resolved in his own mind that on the day following the fatal marriage he would leave his native country, never to visit its green and sunny shores again. Young boy, be not so ready in thy bold and independent conclusions. Remember thou hast a guardian, who is still the arbiter of thy acts and deeds, and thou hast an education that is yet to be finished. And all these things taken into consideration, I think it likely that some time may elapse ere you leave your native shores forever, and before the time of thy minority expires, you may have forgotten that such a being as the lovely Effie Duncan existed, for such is nature, man's nature at least. The evening of the marriage at length arrived, and the young Effie, arrayed in bridal robes, and concealing a bleeding heart beneath a calm and tranquil demeanor, descended to the anxious throng assembled in her father's elegant parlor to witness and enjoy the gay pageant of the marriage festival. Rupert, who had steadily and rigidly refused the entreaties of Dudley and Mr. Duncan to join the train of waiters, without being able to offer any excuse whatever for such a refusal, came forward to a spot where he could obtain a full view of the bride, and fixed his deep, searching gaze on her countenance. Effie might have gone calmly, yes, calmly at least, through the dreadful ceremony. She might even have returned the caresses and gratulations of her family and friends, but for the strange, intense, fixed meaning expression of that long and steady gaze into her very soul. But there are moments in human life when the conventional control usually exercised over the feelings in our intercourse with the world around us will give way beneath our very nature, so to speak, that whatever may be our pride or firmness of strength of mind, we cannot altogether crush or deaden. It is human nature to be natural sometimes, and despite ourselves we cannot choose but be so, and this was a moment in the life of the young Effie when the heart spoke for itself, when it broke from the constraint put upon its pure, warm impulses, and spoke in its own only language, and every heart there, even the most worldly and hardened, understood well the meaning, though they could not know the cause of the deep and deadly paleness that overspread the white cheek of Effie, as the words, "Wilt thou take this man for thy wedded husband, to love, honor, and obey," sounded in her ears, the solemnity of that clergyman's voice and manner adding force to the seriousness of the duty those words imposed. But no answer came from the livid and bloodless lips of the young bride, and though the words fell like ice on her heart, she seemed not to heed their meaning, while her eye roved with a wild and vacant stare for a moment over the crowd, and then fixed as if by fascination upon the convulsed and rigid countenance of Rupert Clare. Mr. Duncan stepped forward and whispered a few words of comfort and encouragement in his daughter's ear, which, however, she did not seem to understand. And while he was speaking, she sunk slowly in his arms, no longer able to bear up under her own strong feelings. "Water, water, she is fainting!" exclaimed Mr. Duncan hurriedly. "Oh, haste, she will die, indeed she will." All the proud, triumphant happiness of the man of a minute before, yielding at once to the feelings of the father and the impulses of a better nature and loftier being. Dudley Allen passed near, pale and trembling, for he really loved Effie with the truth and constancy of a high and noble nature, and pressed her cold hand again and again to his lips, murmuring assurances of affection and love that so far from soothing the half-fainting girl, but sent the arrow deeper into her heart. At this moment, and just as Effie began to recover strength, a little flower, faded, worn, and withered, became detached from the bouquet in her hair and fell to the floor. What woman's caprice had prompted the wearer in placing it, so pale and so colourless, and dried among the rich and blooming flowers that formed her bridal garland? Alack, a woman's heart, who can read it? Not herself. Oftentimes it fell to the floor, the little flower, unnoticed by any eye, save one alone, the eye of him whose touch had made it a sacred relic, and whose words as he presented it had been remembered and believed and wept over and cherished as the prophetic symbols of hope and happiness. Rupert stooped down and secured the flower, and as he gazed upon its faded leaves, mute telltales of the affection that had preserved it so long, all his pride was subdued into remorse for his late cruelty, and something of the truth, half suspected from what took place the day previous, began dimly to shadow itself forth to his mind. When he at length looked up from his reverie, the parties were again arranged on the floor, and the minister was preparing, though evidently with much reluctance at the earnest entreaties of the father, to proceed with the ceremony. The moment Effie recovered, Mr. Duncan was himself again, the man of the world, neither cold nor cruel nor unkind, but the ambitious, unimaginative, solid-thinking and calculating man of the world, who would forget, in the busy hours of bustling life, the warmer ties of human love, to feel yet more sensibly their power and truth, when by his own hearth, with its ring of happy faces around and about him, wife and children and friends, like the mother of the Gracchi, these were his jewels, though not his only jewels. Almost involuntarily, Rupert joined the group on the floor, and scarce knowing what he did, he moved forward to Effie, still holding the withered memento of affection in his hand, and kneeling humbly before her, murmured her name in the low, sweet tones of his musical voice, at the same time gazing up in her face with a mingled expression of hope, curiosity, reproach, pity, and love, not to be mistaken by any there. And Mr. Duncan, already much mortified by his daughter's weakness, and now doubly stung by the strange conduct of Rupert, seized him somewhat rudely by the shoulder, saying as he forced him to rise, "Bold boy, what mean you? How dare you trifle with me, Rupert, in such a moment as this?" "It is no trifling, sir," replied the boy, humbly but firmly. "If your daughter will not say that her heart is against this marriage, and is even now breaking in her bosom, I will leave your presence and hers forever. Ask her, oh ask her, sir, and she will tell you I speak but truth," continued Rupert, clasping his hands in passionate entreaty. "Effie, is this true?" asked Mr. Duncan, turning toward her, but he needed no words to tell him that it was, for his daughter's countenance told it all, but too plainly, alas, to need the superfluous sanction of any words. Mr. Duncan stood irresolute for many minutes, while the shadows of manifold things passing in his mind threw both their light and their gloom upon his countenance. At length he turned to Dudley, who had stood a silent observer of the same, silent, but silent as we are when feeling most, and only with his eyes sought to ask of him the question his heart dictated. Dudley understood him at once, and joining the soft hand that he had gloried in winning as his own, in that of Rupert Clare, he replied to the father's look of inquiry with a sad, sweet smile, "I give her up. I wish not the casket without the jewel. That only made it precious. Effie, I hope you will be happy, for if love ever deserved reward, yours does. Think not of me, for though I cannot forget, yet every dream must have its wakening, and every heart its dream. Dudley Allen did awake from his dream to a life of quiet happiness." "But Rupert is only 15," exclaimed Mr. Duncan in bewilderment. "And 6 months," added Effie, with an arch smile, as she threw her arms round her father's neck and kissed him, joy and hope once more reanimating her countenance. "Do not suppose, dear reader, that Mr. Duncan could sanction a marriage of just 15 years and 6 months. He was too much a man of the world, and our young lovers were even fain to bide their time, as the woman said, in the workhouse, and leave 15 far behind them before the solemn ceremonial was performed that binds till death shall part." End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. Christopher Crotchett, Singing Master, by Seba Smith. Your New England country singing master is a peculiar character. Who shall venture to describe him? During his stay in a country village, he is the most important personage in it. The common schoolmaster, to be sure, is a man of dignity and importance. Children never pass him on the road without turning square round, pulling off their hats, and making one of their best and most profound bows. He is looked up to with universal deference by both young and old, and is often invited out to tea. Or, if he boards round, great is the parade and great the preparation by each family when their week for boarding the master draws near. Then, not unfrequently, a well-fatted porker is killed, and the spare ribs are duly hung round the pantry in readiness for roasting. A half-bushel of sausages are made up into links and suspended on a pole near the ceiling from one end of the kitchen to the other. And the Saturday beforehand, if the schoolmaster is to come Monday, the work of preparation reaches its crisis. Then it is that the old oven, if it be not heaten 7 times hotter than it is wont to be, is at least heated 7 times, and apple pies and pumpkin pies and mince pies are turned out by dozens, and packed away in closet and cellar for the coming week. And the floor-room, which has not had a fire in it for the winter, is now duly washed and scrubbed and put to rights, and wood is heaped on the fire with a liberal hand, till the room itself becomes almost another oven. George is up betimes on Monday morning to go with his hand sled and bring the master's trunk. Betsy and Sally are rigged out in their best calico gowns. The little ones have their faces washed and their hair combed with more than ordinary care, and the mother's cap has an extra crimp. And all this stir and preparation for the common schoolmaster, and he is but an everyday planet that moves in a regular orbit, and comes round at least every winter. But the singing master is your true comet. Appearing at no regular intervals, he comes suddenly and often unexpected, brilliant, mysterious, and erratic. No wonder that he attracts all eyes and produces a tremendous sensation. Not only the children, but the whole family flock to the windows when he passes, and a face may be seen at every pane of glass, eagerly peering out to catch a glimpse of the singing master. Even the very dogs seem to partake of the awe he inspires, and bark with uncommon fierceness whenever they meet him. "Oh, father," said little Jimmy Brown, as he came running into the house on a cold December night, with eyes staring wide open and panting for breath. "Oh, father, Mr. Christopher Crotchett from Quavertown is over to Mr. Gibbs's tavern, come to see about keeping singing school, and Mr. Gibbs and a whole parcel more of 'em want you to come right over, 'cause they're going to have a meeting this evening to see about hiring of him." Squire Brown and his family, all except Jimmy, were seated round the supper table when this interesting piece of intelligence was announced. Everyone save Squire Brown himself gave a sudden start, and at once suspended operations, but the squire, who was a very moderate man, and never did anything from impulse, ate on without turning his head or changing position. After a short pause, however, which was a moment of intense anxiety to some members of the family, he replied to Jimmy as follows:
"I shan't do no such thing. If they want a singing school, they may get it themselves. A singing school won't do us no good, and I've ways enough to spend my money without paying it for singing."
Turning his head round and casting a severe look upon Jimmy, he proceeded with increasing energy:
"Now, sir, hang your hat up and sit down and eat your supper. I should like to know what sent you off to the tavern without leave."
"I wanted to see the singing master," said Jimmy. "Sam Gibbs said there was a singing master over to their house, and so I wanted to see him."
"Well, I'll singing master you," said the squire, "if I catch you to go off so again without leave. Come, don't stand there. Sit down and eat your supper, or I'll trounce you in 2 minutes."
"There, I declare," said Mrs. Brown. "I do think it too bad. I do wish I could live in peace 1 moment of my life. The children will be spoilt and ruined. They never can stir a step nor hardly breathe, but what they must be scolded and fretted to death." Squire Brown had been accustomed to these sudden squalls about 25 years, they having commenced some 6 months or so after his marriage, and long experience had taught him that the only way to escape with safety was to bear away immediately and scud before the wind. Accordingly, he turned again to Jimmy, and with a much softened tone addressed him as follows.
"Come, Jimmy, my son, sit down and eat your supper. That's a good boy. You shouldn't go away without asking your mother or me, but you'll try to remember next time, won't you?"
Jimmy and his mother were both somewhat soothed by this well-timed suavity, and the boy took his seat at the table. "Now, Pa," said Miss Jerusha Brown, "you will go over and see about having a singing school, won't you? I want to go dreadfully."
"Oh, I can't do anything about that," said the squire. "It'll cost a good deal of money, and I can't afford it. And besides, there's no use at all in it. You can sing enough now, any of you. You are singing half your time."
"There," said Mrs. Brown, "that's just the way. Our children will never have a chance to be anything as long as they live. Other folks' children have a chance to go to singing schools and to see young company and to be something in the world. And here's our Jerusha has got to be in her 25th year now, and if she's ever going to have young company and have a chance to be anything, she must have it soon, for she'll be past the time by and by for such things. 'Tisn't as if we was poor and couldn't afford it, for you know, Mr. Brown, you pay the largest tax of anybody in the town, and can afford to give the children a chance to be something as well as not. And as for living in this kind of way any longer, I've no notion on't." Mrs. Brown knew how to follow up an advantage. She had got her husband upon the retreat in the onset a moment before, in reference to Jimmy's absence, and the closing part of this speech was uttered with an energy and determination of which Squire Brown knew too well the import to disregard it. Perceiving that a storm was brewing that would burst upon his head with tremendous power, if he did not take care to avoid it, he finished his supper with all convenient dispatch, rose from the table, put on his greatcoat and hat, and marched deliberately over to Gibbs's tavern. Mrs. Brown knew at once that she had won the victory, and that they should have a singing school. The children also had become so well versed in the science of their mother's tactics that they understood the same thing, and immediately began to discuss matters preparatory to attending the school. Miss Jerusha said that she must have her new calico gown made right up the next day, and her mother said she should, and David might go right over after Betsy Davis to come work on it the next morning. "How delightful it would be to have a singing school," said Miss Jerusha. "Jimmy, what sort of a looking man is Mr. Crotchett?" "Oh, he is a slick kind of a looking man," said Jimmy. "Is he a young man or a married man?" inquired Miss Jerusha. "Oh, married? No, I guess he isn't," said Jimmy. "I don't believe he's more than 20 years old." "Poh, I don't believe that story," said Jerusha. "A singing master must be as much as 25 years old, I know. How is he dressed? Isn't he dressed quite genteel?" "Oh, he's dressed pretty slick," said Jimmy. "Well, that's what makes him look so young," said Miss Jerusha. "I dare say he's as much as 25 years old. Don't you think he is, Mother?"
"Well, I think it's pretty likely he is," said Mrs. Brown. "Singing masters are generally about that age."
"How does he look?" said Miss Jerusha. "Is he handsome?" "He's handsome enough," said Jimmy, "only he's got a red head and freckly face." "Now, Jim, I don't believe a word you say. You are saying this only just to plague me." To understand the propriety of this last remark of Miss Jerusha, the reader should be informed that for the last 10 years she had looked upon every young man who came into the place as her own peculiar property, and in all cases, in order to obtain possession of her aforesaid property, she had adopted prompt measures and pursued them with a diligence worthy of all praise. "No, I ain't neither," said Jimmy. "I say he has got a red head and freckly face."
"Ah, well," said Mrs. Brown, "what if he has? I'm sure a red head don't look bad, and one of the handsomest men that I ever see had a freckly face."
"Well, Jimmy, how large is he? Is he a tall man or a short man?" said Miss Jerusha.
"Why, he isn't bigger round than I," said Jimmy, "and I guess he isn't quite as tall as a haypole, but he's so tall he has to stoop when he goes into the door."
So far from adding to the shock which Miss Jerusha's nerves had already received from the account of the red head and the freckly face, this last piece of intelligence was on the whole rather consolatory, for she lacked but 1.5 inches of 6 feet in height herself. "Well, Jimmy," said Miss Jerusha, "when he stands up. Take him all together. Isn't he a good-looking young man?"
"I don't know anything about that," said Jimmy. "He looks the most like the tongs in the riddle, of anything I can think of. Long legs and crooked thighs, little head and no eyes."
"There, Jim, you little plague," said Miss Jerusha. "You shall go right off to bed if you don't leave off your nonsense. I won't hear another word of it."
"I don't care if you won't," said Jimmy. "It's all true, every word of it."
"What, then the singing master hasn't got no eyes, has he?" said Miss Jerusha. "That's a pretty story."
"I don't mean he hasn't got no eyes at all," said Jimmy. "Only his eyes are dreadful little, and he can't see but one of 'em at a time neither. They're twisted round so. A little cross-eyed, I suppose," said Mrs. Brown. "That's all. I don't think that hurts the looks of a man. It only makes him look a little sharper."
While these things were transpiring at Mr. Brown's, matters of weight and importance were being discussed at the tavern. About a dozen of the neighbors had collected there early in the evening, and everyone, as soon as he found that Mr. Christopher Crotchett from Quavertown was in the village, was for having a singing school forthwith, cost what it would. They accordingly proposed at once to ascertain Mr. Crotchett's terms. His proposals were to keep 20 evenings for $20 and found, or for $30 and board himself. The school was to be kept 3 evenings in a week. A subscription paper was opened, and the sum of $15 was at last made up. But that was the extent to which they could go. Not another dollar could be raised. Much anxiety was now felt for the arrival of Squire Brown, for the question of school or no school depended entirely on him.
"Squire Brown's got money enough," said Mr. Gibbs, "and if he only has the will, we shall have a school."
"Not exactly," said Mr. Jones.
"If Mrs. Brown has the will, we shall have a school, let the squire's will be what it may."
Before the laugh occasioned by this last remark had fully subsided, Squire Brown entered, much to the joy of the whole company.
"Squire Brown, I'm glad to see you," said Mr. Gibbs. "Shall I introduce you to Mr. Christopher Crotchett, singing master from Quavertown?"
The squire was a very short man, somewhat inclined to corpulence, and Mr. Crotchett, according to Jimmy's account, was not quite as tall as a haypole, so that by dint of the squire's throwing his head back and looking up, and Mr. Crotchett's canting his head on one side in order to bring one eye to bear on the squire, the parties were brought within each other's field of vision. The squire made a bow, which was done by throwing his head upward, and Mr. Crotchett returned the compliment by extending his arm downward to the squire and shaking hands. When the ceremony of introduction was over, Mr. Gibbs laid the whole matter before Squire Brown, showed him the subscription paper, and told him they were all depending upon him now to decide whether they should have a singing school or not. Squire Brown put on his spectacles and read the subscription paper over 2 or 3 times, till he fully understood the terms and the deficiency in the amount subscribed. Then, without saying a word, he took a pen and deliberately subscribed $5. That settled the business. The desired sum was raised, and the school was to go ahead. It was agreed that it should commence on the following evening, and that Mr. Crotchett should board with Mr. Gibbs 1 week, with the squire the next, and so go round through the neighborhood. On the following day there was no small commotion among the young folks of the village in making preparation for the evening school. New singing books were purchased, dresses were prepared, curling tongs and crimping irons were put in requisition, and early in the evening the long chamber in Gibbs's tavern, which was called by way of eminence the hall, was well filled by youth of both sexes, the old folks not being allowed to attend that evening, lest the boys and gals should be diffident about sounding the notes. A range of long narrow tables was placed round 3 sides of the hall, with benches behind them, upon which the youth were seated. A singing book and a candle were shared by 2 all round the room, till you came to Miss Jerusha Brown, who had taken the uppermost seat, and monopolized a whole book and a whole candle to her own use. Betsy Buck, a lively, reckless sort of girl of 16, who cared for nobody nor nothing in this world, but was full of frolic and fun, had by chance taken a seat next to Miss Jerusha. Miss Betsy had a slight inward turn of one eye, just enough to give her a roguish look, that comported well with her character. While they were waiting for the entrance of the master, many a suppressed laugh, and now and then an audible giggle, passed round the room, the mere ebullitions of buoyant spirits and contagious mirth without aim or object. Miss Jerusha, who was trying to behave her prettiest, repeatedly chided their rudeness, and more than once told Miss Betsy Buck that she ought to be ashamed to be laughing so much, for what would Mr. Crotchett think if he should come in and find them all of a giggle? After a while the door opened, and Mr. Christopher Crotchett entered. He bent his body slightly as he passed the door, to prevent a concussion of his head against the lintel, and then walked very erect into the middle of the floor, and made a short speech to his class. His grotesque appearance caused a slight tittering round the room, and Miss Betsy was even guilty of an incipient audible laugh, which, however, she had the tact so far to turn into a cough as to save appearances. Still it was observed by Miss Jerusha, who told her again in a low whisper that she ought to be ashamed, and added that Mr. Crotchett was a most splendid man, a beautiful man. After Mr. Crotchett had made his introductory speech, he proceeded to try the voices of his pupils, making each one alone follow him in rising and falling the notes. He passed round without difficulty till he came to Miss Betsy Buck. She rather hesitated to let her voice be heard alone, but the master told her she must sound, and holding his head down so close to hers that they almost met, he commenced pouring his fa sol la into her ear. Miss Betsy drew back a little, but followed with a low and somewhat tremulous voice, till she had sounded 3 or 4 notes, when her risible muscles got the mastery, and she burst out in an unrestrained fit of laughter. The master looked confused and cross, and Miss Jerusha looked even crosser than the master. She again reproached Miss Betsy for her rudeness, and told her in an emphatic whisper, which was intended more especially for the master's ear, that such conduct was shameful, and if she couldn't behave better, she ought to stay at home. Miss Jerusha's turn to sound came next, and she leaned her head full halfway across the table to meet the master's, and sounded the notes clear through, 3 or 4 times over, from bottom to top and from top to bottom, and sounded them with a loudness and strength full equal to that of the master. When the process of sounding the voices separately had been gone through with, they were called upon to sound together, and before the close of the evening they were allowed to commence the notes of some easy tunes. It is unnecessary here to give a detailed account of the progress that was made, or to attempt to describe the jargon of strange sounds with which Gibbs's hall echoed that night. Suffice it to say that the proficiency of the pupils was so great that on the 10th evening, or when the school was half through, the parents were permitted to be present, and were delighted to hear their children sing Old Hundred, Mere, St. Martin's, Northfield, and Hallowell, with so much accuracy that those who knew the tunes could readily tell every time which one was being performed. Miss Brown was almost in ecstasies at the performance, and sat the whole evening and looked at Jerusha, who sang with great earnestness and with a voice raised far above all the rest. Even Squire Brown himself was so much softened that evening that his face wore a sort of smile, and he told his wife
He didn't grudge his $5 a bit.
the school went on swimmingly. Mr. Crotchett became the lion of the village, and Miss Jerusha Brown thought he improved upon acquaintance astonishingly. Great preparation was made at Squire Brown's for the important week of boarding the singing master. They outdid all the village in the quantity and variety of their eatables, and at every meal Miss Jerusha was particularly assiduous in placing all the good things in the neighborhood of Mr. Crotchett's plate. In fact, so bountifully and regularly was Mr. Crotchett stuffed during that week that his lank form began to assume a perceptible fullness. He evidently seemed very fond of his boarding place, especially at mealtime, and made himself so much at home that Mrs. Brown and Jerusha were in a state of absolute felicity the whole week. It was true he spent 2 evenings abroad during the week, and it was reported that one of them was passed at Mr. Buck's. But Miss Jerusha would not believe a word of such story. She said there was no young folks at Mr. Buck's except Betsy, and she was sure Mr. Crotchett was a man of more sense than to spend his evenings with such a wild, rude thing as Betsy Buck. Still, however, the report gave her a little uneasiness, and when it was ascertained that during the week on which Mr. Crotchett boarded at Mr. Buck's he spent every evening at home, except the 3 devoted to the singing school, Miss Jerusha's uneasiness evidently increased. She resolved to make a desperate effort to counteract these untoward influences, and to teach Miss Betsy Buck not to interfere with other folks' concerns. For this purpose she made a grand evening party, and invited all the young folks of the village except Miss Buck, who was pointedly left out. The treat was elaborate for a country village, and Miss Jerusha was uncommonly assiduous in her attentions to Mr. Crotchett during the evening. But to her inexpressible surprise and chagrin, about 8 o'clock, Mr. Crotchett put on his hat and greatcoat, and bade the company good night. Miss Brown looked very blue, and Miss Jerusha's nerves were in a state of high excitement. What could it mean? She would give anything in the world to know where he had gone. She ran into the chamber and looked out from the window. The night was rather dark, but she fancied she saw him making his way toward Mr. Buck's. The company for the remainder of the evening had rather a dull time, and Miss Jerusha passed almost a sleepless night. The next evening Miss Jerusha was early at the singing school. She took her seat with a disconsolate air, opened her singing book, and commenced singing Hallowell in the following words: As on some lonely building's top the sparrow tells her moan, far from the tents of joy and hope, I sit and grieve alone. On former occasions, when the scholars were singing before school commenced, the moment the master opened the door they broke off short, even if they were in the midst of a tune. But now, when the master entered, Miss Jerusha kept on singing. She went through the whole tune after Mr. Crotchett came in, and went back and repeated the latter half of it with a loud and full voice, that caused a laugh among the scholars, and divers streaks of red to pass over the master's face. At the close of the evening's exercises, Miss Jerusha hurried on her shawl and bonnet, and watched the movements of the master. She perceived he went out directly after Betsy Buck, and she hastened after them with becoming speed. She contrived to get between Miss Buck and the master as they walked along the road, and kept Mr. Crotchett in close conversation with her, or rather kept herself in close conversation with Mr. Crotchett, till they came to the corner that turned down to Mr. Buck's house. Here Mr. Crotchett left her somewhat abruptly, and walked by the side of Miss Betsy toward Mr. Buck's. This was more than Miss Jerusha's nerves could well bear. She was under too much excitement to proceed on her way home. She stopped and gazed after the couple as they receded from her. As their forms became indistinct in the darkness of the night, she turned and followed them, just keeping them in view till they reached the house. The door opened, and to her inexpressible horror, they both went in. It was past 10 o'clock, too. She was greatly puzzled. The affair was entirely inexplicable to her. It could not be, however, that he would stop many minutes, and she waited to see the result. Presently a light appeared in the foreroom, and from the mellowness of that light a fire was evidently kindled there. Miss Jerusha approached the house and reconnoitred. She tried to look in at the window, but a thick curtain effectively prevented her from seeing anything within. The curtain did not quite reach to the top of the window, and she thought she saw the shadows of 2 persons before the fire thrown against the ceiling. She was determined by some means or other to know the worst of it. She looked round the dooryard and found a long piece of board. She thought by placing this against the house by the side of the window, she might be able to climb up and look over the top of the curtain. The board was accordingly raised on one end and placed carefully by the side of the window, and Miss Jerusha eagerly commenced the task of climbing. She had reached the top of the curtain, and cast one glance into the room, where sure enough she beheld Mr. Crotchett seated close by the side of Miss Betsy. At this interesting moment, from some cause or other, either from her own trembling, for she was exceedingly agitated, or from the board not being properly supported at the bottom, it slipped and canted, and in an instant one half of the window was dashed with a tremendous crash into the room. Miss Jerusha fell to the ground, but not being much injured by the fall, she sprang to her feet and ran with the fleetness of a wild deer. The door opened, and out came Mr. Crotchett and Mr. Buck, and started in the race. They thought they had a glimpse of some person running up the road when they first came out, and Mr. Crotchett's long legs measured off the ground with remarkable velocity. But the fright had added so essentially to Miss Jerusha's powers of locomotion that not even Mr. Crotchett could overtake her, and her pursuers soon lost sight of her in the darkness of the night, and gave up the chase and returned home. Miss Jerusha was not seen at the singing school after this, and Miss Brown said she stayed home because she had a cough. Notwithstanding, there were many rumors and surmises afloat, and some slanderous insinuations thrown out against Miss Jerusha Brown. Yet it was never ascertained by the neighbors for a certainty who it was that demolished Mr. Buck's window. One item farther remains to be added to this veritable history, and that is that in 3 months from this memorable night, Miss Betsy Buck became Miss Crotchett of Quavertown. End of Section 3.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, A Visit to Wordsworth, by the Reverend Orville Dewey. From Ambleside I took a pony and rode to Rydal Mount, the residence of Mr. W. I was so much disappointed in the appearance of Mr. W. that I actually began to suspect that I had come to the cottage of one of his neighbors. After 10 minutes' commonplace talk about the weather, the traveling, etc., had passed, I determined to find out whether I was mistaken, and aware of his deep interest in the politics of England, I availed myself of some remark that was made to introduce that subject. He immediately quit all commonplace and went into the subject with a flood almost of conversation that soon left me in no doubt. After this had gone on an hour or two, wishing to change the theme, I took occasion of a pause to observe that in this great political agitation, poetry seemed to have died out entirely. He said it had, but that was not the only cause, for there had been, as he thought, some years ago, an overproduction and a surfeit. Mr. W. converses with great earnestness, and has a habit as he walks and talks of stopping every fourth or fifth step and turning round to you to enforce what he is saying. The subjects the first evening I passed with him were, as I have said, politics and poetry. He remarked afterward that although he was known to the world only as a poet, he had given 12 hours' thought to the condition and prospects of society, for one to poetry. I replied that there appeared to me to be no contradiction in this, since the spirit of poetry is the spirit of humanity, since sympathy with humanity and with all its fortunes is an essential characteristic of poetry, and politics is one of the grandest forms under which the welfare of the human race presents itself. In politics, Mr. W. professes to be a reformer, but upon the most deliberate plan and scale, and he indulges in the most indignant and yet argumentative diatribes against the present course of things in England, and in the saddest forebodings of what is to come. The tide is beating now against aristocracy as an established religion, and if it prevails, anarchy and irreligion must follow. He will see no other result. He has no confidence in the people. They are not fit to govern themselves, not yet, certainly. Public opinion, the foolish opinion of the depraved, ignorant, and conceited mass, ought not to be the law. It ought not to be expressed in law. It ought not to be represented in government. The true representative government should represent the mind of a country, and that is not found in the mass, nor is it to be expressed by universal suffrage. Mr. W. constantly protested against the example of America as not being in point. He insisted that the state of society, the crowded population, the urgency of want, the tenures of property in England made a totally different case from ours. He seemed evidently to admit, though he did not in terms, that hereditary rank and an established priesthood are indefensible in the broadest views of human rights and interests, but the argument for them is that they cannot be removed without opening the door to greater evils, to the unrestrained license of the multitude, to incessant change, disorder, uncertainty, and finally to oppression and tyranny. He says the world is running mad with the notion that all its evils are to be relieved by political changes, political remedies, political nostrums, whereas the great evils, sin, bondage, misery, lie deep in the heart, and nothing but virtue and religion can remove them. And upon the value and preciousness and indispensableness of religion, indeed, he talked very sagely, earnestly, and devoutly. The next evening I went to tea to Mr. W.'s on a hospitable invitation to come to breakfast, dinner, or tea, as I liked. The conversation very soon, again, ran upon politics. He thought there could be no independence in legislators who were dependent for their places upon the ever-wavering breath of popular opinion, and he wanted my opinion about the fact in our country. I replied that as a secluded man and accustomed to look at the morale of these matters, I certainly had felt that there was likely to be, and probably was, a great want of independence, that I had often expressed the apprehension that our distinguished men were almost necessarily acting under biases that did not permit them to sit down in their closets and examine great political questions and measures in a fair and philosophical spirit. Then he said, how can there be any safety? I answered, as I had frequently said before, that our only safety lay in making the people wise. But I added that our practical politicians were accustomed to say that there was a principle of safety in our conflicts, in the necessarily conflicting opinions of the mass, that they neutralized and balanced each other. I admitted, however, that there was danger, that all popular institutions involved danger, that freedom was a trust, and a perilous trust. Still, I insisted that this was only an instance of a general principle, that all probation was perilous, that the greatest opportunity was always the greatest peril. I maintained also that, think as we might of political liberty, there was no helping it, that in the civilized world the course of opinion was irresistibly setting toward universal education and popular forms of government, and nothing was to be done but to direct, modify, and control the tendency. He fully admitted this, said that in other centuries some glorious results might be brought out, but that he saw nothing but darkness, disorder, and misery in the immediate prospect, and that all he could do was to cast himself on Providence. I ventured to suggest that it seemed to me that all good and wise men had a work to do. I said that I admitted, friend to popular institutions as I was, that the world was full of errors about liberty, and there was a mistaken madness about popular freedom, as if it were the grand panacea for all human ills, and that powerful pens were needed to guide the public mind, and that the pen of genius could scarcely be more nobly employed. But he has no confidence in the body of the people, in their willingness to read what is wholesome or to do what is right. And this, I took the liberty to say, seemed to me the radical point on which he and I differed. I told him that there were large communities in America in whom I did confide, and that I believed other communities might be raised up to the same condition, and that it appeared to me that it should be the grand effort of the world now to raise up this mass to knowledge, to comfort and virtue, since the mass was evidently ere long to rule for us. After this conversation, Mr. W. proposed a walk to Grassmere Lake to see it after sunset, and in that loveliest of all scenes I ever witnessed on earth were lost all thoughts but of religion and poetry. I could not help saying, with fervent sincerity, I thank you, sir, for bringing me here at this hour, for he had evidently taken some pains, pushing aside some little interferences with his purpose to accomplish it. He said in reply that so impressive was the scene to him that he felt almost as if it were a sin not to come here every fair evening. We sat by the shore half an hour and talked of themes far removed from the strife of politics. The village on the opposite side lay in deep shadow, from which the tower of the church rose like heaven's sentinel on the gates of evening. A single taper shot its solitary ray across the waters. The little lake lay hushed in deep and solemn repose. Not a sound was heard upon its shore. The fading light trembled upon the bosom of the waters, which were here slightly ruffled, and there lay as a mirror to reflect the serenity of heaven. The dark mountains lay beyond, with every varying shade that varying distance could give them. The farthest ridges were sowed with light, as if it were resolved into separate particles and showered down into the darkness below to make it visible. The mountainside had a softness of shadowing upon it, such as I never saw before, and such as no painting I ever saw approached in the remotest degree. It seemed, Mr. W. said, as if it were clothed with the air. Above all was the clear sky, looking almost cold. It looked so pure along the horizon, but warmed in the region a little higher with the vermilion tints of the softest sunset. I am persuaded that the world might be travelled over without the sight of one such spectacle as this, and all owing to the circumstances, the time, the hour. It was perhaps not the least of those circumstances influencing the scene that it was an hour passed in one of his own holy retreats with Wordsworth. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by April 6090. The Rover Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. A Leaf from the Notebook of an Old Bachelor by C.F. Hoffman. 49? Yes, I was 49 yesterday. In my 50th year? Heavens, how time passes! I met young George W. at C's dinner yesterday, and for the life of me I couldn't conceive that tall young dandy was my Araminta's son. Had I had the training of the boy, he should never have worn those hideous mustachios. The young rascal looked at me as if he knew I had once aspired to be his father. Zounds! I could have kicked the puppy. But then he had his mother's eyes, and they were all to love and me. Poor Araminta! She is not happy, doesn't look it. That eye that reads the ground. Pshaw! What is it to me what she reads? It isn't my fault that she has a brute for a husband. I was talking about him last night with Laura Kay, and we both agreed it was a most ill-assorted marriage. Laura ought to know the man's disposition, too, since she was so long engaged to him. I wonder if her flirtation with Ned Effingham was not the cause of that match being broken off? She's a good girl, Laura Kay. I've thought so this 30 years. Somehow or other, though I'm afraid matters will never come to anything between us. I shouldn't know where to spend my evenings if she were married, and as some fool has said before me, what a bore our club is. I really can't stand it for more than 2 nights in a week. The only thing that takes me there is to see Poins Grey Bait, Twaddleton, Fitzflummery. I used to think that something might be made of Fitz. But what can you expect of a man who eats peanuts and spells music with a K? Beggavin was there, solemn and pompous as ever, and little Fitz bowing to him as usual. That man always recalls the sentence of Rochefoucauld that I used to parse in my French exercises when a schoolboy. Gravity is but a mystery of the body to conceal the defects of the mind. He is always associated in my mind with a bulky and stupid edition of Wanastrait's Grammar. We talked French affairs and the new restaurant in Park Place. Flummery thought that there was some deep political design beneath the French courses, which are so gradually ousting steaks and chops from the tables of dinners out. And Augustus Simperley held up his hands in holy horror when the word war was mentioned. Scourge of nations, croaked Beggavin, bane of arts and industry, will the sacred influence of religion never, etc., etc. What an age of cant we do live in! Hear what a man of sense, who wrote 2 generations since, says on this subject. No complaints are more frequent than against the weather when it suits not our purpose. A dismal session. We shall all be drowned, or we shall be burnt up. And yet we never think that there might be more occasion to complain were the weather left to our own direction. The weather is not the only instance of distrust in Providence. It is a common topic to declaim against war. Manifold, indeed, are the blessings of peace, but doth war never produce any good? A fair comparison may possibly make it doubtful whether war, like the weather, ought not to be resigned to the conduct of Providence. Seldom are we in the right when we repine at its dispensation. There's a deal of good sense in this simple proposition. Ay, and of sound religion too. For however we may speculate upon the interference of heaven in our free agency among the more trifling concerns of life, the daily routine of individual existence, who can doubt but that he who sends the sunshine and the storm, and holds the nations in the hollow of his hand, loses them only at his pleasure against each other, and sends blessing abroad as well in the firebrand and the thunderbolt as in the dew and the sunbeam? There are some virtues which, like the nutritious plants that subsisted Ross and his companions in their ice-ribbed bower, will spring only beneath an iron blast. There are vices, too, which, like the poisonous vegetation of a southern swamp, flourish only in sultry repose. Commercial enterprise exerts such a tremendous effect, both salutary and pernicious, in our age and country, that its influences have been greater here in a few years of peace and prosperity than centuries of political tranquillity have made them in other countries. Our strides in improvement and in degeneracy have been alike gigantic. Our people in the aggregate are becoming daily more distinguished for boldness and energy in executing schemes that tend to the aggrandization of communities. But I think that the thousand means ever attendant upon the inordinate thirst of gain are not less apparent. The doctrines of utilitarianism, so much in vogue, tend always at last to a sordid centering in self. The cui bono, when applied so immediately to learning, to politics, and to the domestic relations of life, must inevitably rob virtue of its vitality, and cause everything like elevation of character to exhale from the land. I daily see motives of action avowed in the newspapers and in society that would have damned a man both politically and privately 20 years ago. The assumption of disinterestedness is, to be sure, the mere homage which worldliness pays to honor. But when the offering is no longer made, it is pretty strong evidence that the altar has ceased to be in repute. I like the Frenchman, and would hate to quarrel with him, but we certainly do want a war, if it is only to make people talk about francs instead of dollars. I see a new work from Cooper is announced. I like Cooper. His faults are grievous, but I like him. There's a good deal of brawny talent about Cooper. Subject him to comparative criticism, and, as a standard, he is not to be named with Irving, Channing, or Verplanck, but examine his writings analytically, and he stands well by himself. His defects I regard only as I do the scales of a shellbark hickory. The excrescences afford a ready foothold for cats and critics, but they do not mar the vigorous proportions of the stalwart trunk. I have passed a delightful hour in Inman's studio today. Artists appear to me to be the only men that have anything peculiar about them, and I like them on that account. The nature of their pursuits guards them from the coarser attrition of the world, which sooner or later makes all men duplicates of each other, and their intercourse with the best educated portions of society just polishes them enough to leave some character of their own. What a fervor of spirit there is in Eye's pictures! His figures appear to me sometimes out of drawing, but his heads certainly have an eloquence of coloring which I see in no other painter. There is life, breathing breezy life, in the quivering forests of coal, and there is heaven, to me, in the delicious skies of wire. But I have seen some women's faces by Inman, in which life and heaven, in which the bliss of other worlds, and the tenderness of this, in which the muscle and blood and fibre of God's creatures, with all the intellect he has ever breathed into them, were blended with the Promethean power. This is the poetry of the art, and the actual portraits that are embodied with it have a far greater charm in my eyes than the regularly featured ideals of the painter's imagination. The most enchanting features that I ever looked upon were those of a Saint Somebody painted, by the by, from a naughty nun, that I saw once in Mexico. The picture carried me back at once to the Florentine gallery, and I stood once more, an ardent boy of 19, before the wives and mistresses of the great Italian masters, that still survive in their adorable Madonnas. It was the image of little Emma Atherton, except that it did not eternally show its teeth, like a walking advertisement to the Crawfords. By the way, it always strikes me that this is a beautiful thing, a woman being immortalized by her lover. How much more we like those who have come down to us in painting and in song than those who have taken the reins of fame's chariot in their own hands, and, like that false-hearted vixen, the English Elizabeth, who swore like a coachman, thrashed down to posterity like a Bowery trotter on the Third Avenue. Women should appear to be wooed, even by fame. The ancients, to be sure, personified her as a sister female, but then she was always a girl of bad report, and those of her sex who would wear her favors should employ a go-between to make the advances. Tuesday. What a vile capricious climate ours is here along the seaboard. Yesterday was just one of those days when women never take their hair out of paper, but, shawling over the loose array of their neglected toilet, sit stewing over the last new novel, wherever they may happen to settle down after breakfast. I did not go into the parlor, for I hate to sloven, and 3 out of the 5 pretty women at our boarding-house might read Jeremy Taylor's Marriage Ring to advantage. How beautifully does the old fellow allude to that delicate consideration for each other's tastes and feelings, which must, after all, constitute the soul of happiness in married life, and the want of which, in the springtime of affection, must wither its buds, even as they are blowing into life. Everything can blast an infant blossom, and the breath of the south can shake the little rings of the vine, when first they begin to curl like the locks of a new-weaned boy, but when by age and consolidation they stiffen into the hardness of a stem, and have, by the warm embraces of the sun and the kisses of heaven, brought forth their clusters, they can endure the storms of the north and the loud noises of the tempest, and yet never be broken. So, says the old-fashioned preacher, are the early unions of an unfixed marriage. So Lady Morgan's come out with a new work. Why don't that woman stop writing? There's talent in her works, but then the jargon in which they are written makes me sick. She crams in the words against the stomach of my sense, and I always have to take a page or two of Cobbett's wholesome English to restore its tone. Cobbett. You read Cobbett, the renegade? Yes, I know it. I know it all, and yet I read Cobbett. I read him for his real hard-horse sense. I delight in that down-right, go-ahead style of his, which grapples with the subject like an English bulldog, and, whether it be great or little, a yearling heifer or a full-grown buffalo, flings it down before you, so that you can put your foot upon it. Sheer sense urged with masculine force, and an inextinguishable spirit, give an influence to that man's writings which even his rascally character can hardly impair. I would insure them for a low premium on their voyage to posterity. For talent, like the Egyptian embalmers of old, preserves the bad as well as the good, the reptile as well as the man from destruction. I saw C. last night at Mrs. How much that man has altered since we were schoolboys together. He has taken up politics as a trade, which I consider as bad as selling one's self to the devil, a thing which I thought had gone out entirely, till I witnessed the arch necromancy of M. Adrian. Politics, though an excellent mistress, makes but a poor wife. To flirt with them lends a zest to existence, but to be wedded to them dries up the best springs of life, for ambition, swallowing up all other passions and affections, devours, like Saturn, each kindly offspring of the heart, in order to sit alone upon a barren throne. C has proved a perfect worldling, but my estimate of his abilities is as high as ever. I do not think, indeed, that I have ever been mistaken in the minds of my intimates, though I have certainly made some queer blunders in gauging their hearts. Such mistakes are nothing to a man, but I cannot conceive anything more unhappy for a woman than a want of discrimination of character in forming her friendships and fixing her partialities. Life has, comparatively, so few resources for her, that when she misplaces her affections, the error is often irretrievable. She is being of sympathy. Her feelings go forth in the morning of life like the sunbeam in the apologue, that sought all day some object to reflect back its warmth, and found it only in the freezing wave that broke even as it mocked its image at the evening's close. Some one turned this idea prettily in the game of crambo at Mrs. the other evening. I suspect it was Clara F., from the fact of S., a few moments before, having pronounced her the most unsentimental woman in the world. Ay, thus 'tis, I would have them think, the world of which I ne'er knew one. That was not cold as waves that drink, and smile to cheat the wooing sun. For have friendship's falseness proved, have loved as woman's loved before, have loved as she who once hath loved, can love again on earth no more. It matters not how friends deceived, it matters not how love went wrong. I only feel that I believed, I only know I hoped too long. What's let to me, that mid the crowd there may be some unlike the rest, that at the shrine to which I've bowed, others may kneel, nor kneel. Unblessed, though many a heart hopes see upon, freighted like mine, may reach the shore. Its encheering track is lost to one that knows nor sail nor compass more. Ruth Latimer went as Mrs., and entertained me with a philosophical disquisition upon ladylike young men. She assimilated the quadrille, in which she was dancing, to a cotton factory, because there were so many spindles running. Ruth's a clever woman, but I never heard of a girl who joked herself into a husband. And yet I like humor in a woman, especially when it softens beauty, like that of Kate Hesketh. Humor is more akin to feeling than wit is, punning like mimicry. I take to be merely a low order of the last. The possession of humor, I think, always implies a delicacy of perception, which is generally accompanied by sensibility. Coleridge must have been of this opinion when he said that men of humor are always in some degree men of genius. Wits are always so, although a man of genius may, amongst other gifts, possess wit. So did Shakespeare. And dost thou think of me sometimes beautiful, Inez? Do thy young thoughts steal away to him, whose mind never wanders from thee? Doth the crowd of gay worshippers that kneel to thy charms still leave room for my shadow to hover noticed near? And thou wishest, too, my own one, that my letters should not alone record each incident that passes while I'm away, but that they should bear the impress of each thought and feeling of the soul that still turns to thee, where my footsteps lead. Thou wouldst that? Certainly our souls must transmigrate, and that too while vitality still lives in all the functions of our grosser system. How otherwise can we thus lose our moral identity? The faded characters of this letter I know to be mine. The 20 years that have elapsed since it was written have left the mechanical imprint of my fingers the same. But I, myself, I am not the one that thought and felt as they would have me believe. Gone, gone, forever gone, gone like the leaf in the stream that can never return. Gone like the star that went out in the sky when none were watching. Gone like the light that escaped from the limbs of Meleager when his mother consumed the mystic brand upon which his existence depended. Wednesday. I spent yesterday in arranging some old letters, and had an awful attack of the blue devils in consequence. I never was one of those who could understand what the sentimental writers call enjoying a pleasing melancholy. I should as soon think of enjoying a fit of the gout. And as for reviving old associations, disinterring the buried memories from the tomb of my soul, as for taking pleasure in that, why, I would just as soon seek satisfaction in a catacomb of the departed friends of my youth. I would rather, yes, I would, sit cheek by jowl with the dead, the inanimate dead, than make companions of thoughts, which, viper-like, quicken into a gnawing existence the moment they are quarried from the flint where they have lain harmlessly torpid. Pshaw! I'm getting Byronic. It comes of eating cheese and drinking sherry that has not been properly decanted. I must go see Power. Sunday. I heard Mr. preach this morning. There's a great deal of the divine afflatus about that man. he always addresses himself to both my natures. The elements of his discourse are gathered from the most familiar stories of this workday world, homely but strong, and rudely fashioned in themselves, but positively placed together, like a pyre of faggots upon a holy altar of old. They seem kindled at last by fire from heaven itself, the ponderous war club with which the preacher at one moment beats down the ranks of infidelity, is transformed the next into the torch which marshals the faithful to victory. It has often occurred to me that the clergymen of our country mingle too little with the world to give full efficiency to their office. They are too often like soldiers, well skilled in the use of their weapons, but ignorant of the enemy they are to fight against. 10 years of active life in Wall Street, or the Court of Sessions, would, I think, form the best introductory school for the pulpit. Men whose minds are so rarely kindled by the collision, or shaped by the attrition of society, must labor under an immense disadvantage in their efforts to awaken electric feeling in others, or to adapt the workings of their intellect to the caliber of those around them. If truth only comes from heaven, there's no need in preaching. But if the preacher be the instrument of heaven, the agent must in some degree be fashioned according to the material upon which it has to operate. I took this ground in an argument with Mrs. the other night, and I cannot but think that I was right. Unhappily, however, for the progress of society, there are those who read the only book of true knowledge so strangely, that they seem to learn thence that the essence of religion consists in withdrawing ourselves from all communion with our fellows, while in fact the spirit of Christianity is at war with all monkish seclusion, and acknowledge only those virtues to be such which flourish in the breath of a blighting world, which lead us abroad to mingle with our fellows, to test our truth and charity by temptation and sympathy, to take human nature as we find it, and better it where we may, to sit down with publicans and Pharisees at the board, to be all things to all men, the first receivers of the world, had they banded together and buried themselves in a monastery, would have been about as true to their trust as are some of our modern pietists who shrink so sensitively from a contact with the follies of the world. Christianity is emphatically the religion of society, but there is no disposition of man in the highest social state to which he is capable of attaining that is not cared for in its provisions. But how can those provisions ever elevate and improve the condition of mankind at large, if they who are earliest embraced in them go out from the rest as a separate people, and let the blessings meant for all perish with a few? It may indeed be dangerous thus to expose the flock to the perils which perhaps the shepherd alone sought to encounter. But what would we think of a missionary who wrapped his converts out of sight the moment they were made, instead of leaving them to add to their numbers from their heathen brethren around them? I regard every clergyman as a missionary. You cannot argue with a woman. Her opinions are half the time merely prejudices, and while she mistakes dogmatizing for discussion, you can hardly expect a fair interchange of sentiment upon any abstract subject. If you corner her in an argument, she throws herself upon the prerogative of her sex. And if in the concourse of your reasoning you do flash conviction upon her, she deprives you of the satisfaction of a full demonstration by jumping at once to your conclusion, like a spirited but ill-trained pointer. She first hunts wide in spite of all your efforts to keep her to the game, and then flushes your bird before you can get your finger on the trigger. The mind may draw its strength from solitude, but it derives its suppleness from society, and adaptability with slender acquirements better fits one for shining in company than the profoundest intellectual resources without it. But though versatility be so attractive a quality, how rarely do we meet with those who either have possessed it naturally or cultivated it with success, to give the body a just development of its proportions. Each separate muscle must be duly exercised, and every faculty of the mind should receive its proper share of cultivation, to perfect the understanding. But our minds, lies our bodies, are generally exercised at random, and the improvement of some of their powers too often purchased with the neglect and consequent enfeeblement of others, while not 1 in a million can boast that union of strength and elasticity that has been so whimsically assimilated to the trunk of an elephant, which, in the words of Peter Pindar, can pick up pins and yet possess the vigor for trimming well the jacket of a tiger. Most ordinary people can talk well upon some one subject, but how few are there who can happily discuss a dozen, or even maintain their ground in an excursive conversation with sufficient ability to act as the drawer out of others. Conversationalist, in fact, seems the rarest of talents, when we recollect how few are noted for its possession, and that even they who enjoy the reputation of talking well more frequently harangue instead of conversing, pouring out their own thoughts with eloquence, but never mingling the stream with another's. It is one thing to delight a whole table, and another to fix the favor of each one present at it, by eliciting their powers of entertainment. Some species of mental pain is like steam, and care, though when unconfined, it dissipates in air, and when shut up too closely, it shatters the mind that would so repress it. Yet, properly managed, it may, in strong understandings, conduce to their moral energies. At least, I have no doubt that some of the happiest productions of genius owe their brilliancy, if not their birth, to the intensity of mind that authors have brought to one subject in the strenuous effort to distract their thoughts from another. Tuesday. Love is a bad tenant for one's bosom, for when compelled to quit, he always leaves the mansion more or less out of repair. I saw Flora F. at Mrs. 's soiree last night, and was amazed to hear a girl of her sense sport the opinions she did. A baffled attachment certainly spoils a woman in most cases, though it as certainly mellows their disposition delightfully in others. It depends entirely whether, when discomfited, she makes society or religion her point de pay, these being the only resources and muniments to which she may retreat and be upholden. Love with women is like the celebrated Greek fire, which is impossible to detach from the object upon which it is fastened, without the excision of an integral part. The best half of that girl's heart must be gone, or she never would have sung that song with so little emotion. It was one that poor F. wrote for her a few months before he died, and which, telling his story so faithfully years ago, portrayed her own situation so singularly at present. C. says that the imitation of the Waller and Sedley school is to be servile, but in spite of its old English conceits, I certainly think there is a dash of true feeling in the following song. I will love her no more. 'Tis a waste of the heart, this lavish of feeling, a prodigal's part. Who, heedless the treasure a life could not earn, squanders forth where he vainly may look for return. I will love her no more. It is folly to give our best years to one when for many we live, and he who the world will thus barter for one, I ween by such traffic but soon must be undone. I will love her no more. It is heathenish thus to kneel to an idol which bends not to us, which heeds not, which recks not, which cares not for aught that the worship of years to its altar hath bought. I will love her no more, for no love is without its limit in measure, and mine hath run out. She engrosseth it all, until some she restore. Then this moment I love her. How can I love her more? End of section 5.
Section 6 of the Rover Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Olly A.G. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. A sketch by Mrs. Elizabeth Oakes Smith. She was just to be married, happy, gay, and beautiful, wholly devoted to her lover. And yet I had the audacity to tell her I loved her. She laughed in my face, not a laugh of scorn, for that is dreadful in a woman, and would have made me hate her, but a natural, easy laugh of incredulity, as if the absurdity of the idea were a subject for merriment. I believe she thought it impossible for love to exist without hope. And she was so happy, so free from vanity, and so full of spirit she either could not or would not understand me. It is true I did not tell my passion in very lover-like style, for she was so gay I could get no chance. And when I did, there was her low, musical laugh. And then she gave me her pocket handkerchief, bade me to keep it to wipe my tears, and come and dance at her wedding. The gypsy! I could have cried in good earnest. And yet who could cry while her beaming eyes were turned full in my face, and the melody of her voice was ringing in my ears? Everything she spoke upon seemed touched with her own brilliant fancy, and acquired the delicate colouring of her own pure and impassioned soul. Well, they were married. The lover was worthy of the bride, and they were happy. With a cold, damp brow, and hands like marble, I witnessed the ceremony that closed to me the avenue of hope, and affected the gaiety which others felt. I went to my room and took the dainty handkerchief she had given me, and fastened it by one corner over my writing table. Here, day after day, as I pursued the duties of my profession, I gazed upon it as a memento of blasted hopes. The pretty device in the corner, the fair penmanship, and then the aristocratic name, Isabella, all fed my fancy, and kept up melancholy associations. Thus week after week passed away, and there seemed no prospect that time, the great reliever of others' woes, would mitigate mine. I grew listless and abstracted. Wealth and fame, what were they to me? The sick heart turns with disgust from all these things. One night I returned to my room. I recollect it was Monday. At any other time I should have admired the neatness with which the maid had arranged the appurtenances of my chamber. But I was wretched now. This hopeless passion was wearing me into the grave. I felt it in my languid limbs, the lazy flow of my blood, and the feeble beat of my pulse. I had lost a case in court, which at any other time I might have won with little effort, only by my indifference and inactivity. My client was exasperated. I could not blame him, and I could have wept with sorrow and vexation. A tear did indeed start to my eye, in spite of my manhood. I seated myself at my table and mechanically raised my hand to the dear memento suspended over it. It may wipe my tears while my heart is breaking, I thought. As I pressed it to my face, its touch seemed less delicate than usual, and I lifted my eyes to ascertain the cause. The maid had taken it down to wash, and suspended in its place one of her own, clean, white and coarse. Hannah Mopsy was worked in round capitals in the corner. I looked upon it for a moment and then burst into a loud long laugh that sent the blood with a start into every part of my body. I was completely cured. End of section 6. Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Olly A.G. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 7. An independent judge and an ingenious advocate. Disraeli, in his reign of Charles I, has this picture. While the speaker was addressing Judge Jenkins, the old man in a low voice requested his companion not to reply. Let all the malice fall upon me. My ears can better bear it. The speaker having ended, Judge Jenkins asked whether they would not give him liberty to speak. Yes, so you be not very long. No, I will not trouble either myself or you with many words. Mr. Speaker, you said the House was offended at my behavior in not making my obeisance to you when they brought me here. And this was the more wondered at, because I pretended to be knowing in the laws of the land. I answer that I not only pretend to be, but am knowing in the laws of the land, having made them my study for these 45 years. And it is because I am so is the reason of my behavior. As long as you had the king's arms engraven on your mace, and that your great seal was no counterfeit, and acting under his authority, I would have bowed in obedience to his writ, by which you were first called. But, Mr. Speaker, since you and this House have renounced your allegiance to your sovereign, and are become a den of thieves, should I bow myself in this house of Rimmon, the Lord would not pardon me. The whole house was electrified. All rose in uproar and confusion. It was long ere order could be obtained, or their fury could exhaust itself. It seemed as if every member shrunk from a personal attack. The House voted the prisoners guilty of high treason, without any trial, and should suffer as in case of condemnation for treason. They called in the keeper of Newgate to learn the usual days of execution, which were Wednesdays and Fridays. The day to be appointed then became the subject of their debate. At this critical moment, when it seemed to be out of all human chances to spare, the life of the greatest clerk, but not the wisest man, the facetious and dissolute Harry Martin, who had not yet spoken, rose. Not to dissent from the vote of the House, he observed, but he had something to say about the time of the execution. Mr. Speaker, every one must believe that this old gentleman here is fully possessed in his head, resolved to die a martyr in his cause, for otherwise he would never have provoked the House by such biting expressions. If you execute him, you do precisely that which he hopes for, and his execution will have great influence over the people, since he is condemned without a jury. I therefore move that we should suspend the day of execution, and in the meantime force him to live in spite of his teeth. The drollery of the motion put the House into better humour, and the state prisoners were remanded. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 8, Summer, by Labree. O summer dear, with flowers of richest hue, and sweetest odour with thy zephyrs bland, fan the hot brow of labour, and subdue soul's ardent warmth, for by my good right hand, and by my heart which to myself is true, and by the freedom of my native land, 90 degrees of heat with sweat outpouring makes my muse faint almost to think of soaring. O summer dear, thy blushes tempt my heart to worship thee, thou nurse of sweetest flowers. For from thy odorous veils what perfumes start, borne by the rosy zephyrs through thy bowers, and to my senses glowing thoughts impart, so that the wearisome and dull-paced hours dance with a lighter step o'er earth away, while some new rapture gilds each coming day. O summer dear, I love thy bubbling brooks, for their sweet music soothes the heart of care. The carolling of birds mid grassy nooks, their songs of rapture floating in the air, sure they would win a scholar from his books, and steal a smile from that old stoled despair, quicken dull age's footsteps, and renew on beauty's cheek the rose's blushing hue. Alas, man's life is but a checkered scene of joy and laughter, hate, love, tears, and woe. And woman's likewise, from Britannia's queen down to the humble peasant, all must know that lights and shadows aye will intervene to teach us our own weakness, and to show how frail we are when fate's dark clouds hang o'er us, and death's dread veil spreads wide and drear before us. And well it is so, lest, as life is brief, we place too much endearment on this earth, and the dread thought of leaving were such grief as to destroy the innocence of mirth, and bring our years into the yellow leaf, ere we had scarcely entered manhood's birth. But as it is by numerous ills oppressed, we welcome death, it brings eternal rest. But this is merely moral speculation, for which the market can effect no sale. For morals in this everyday creation, like fish and mutton, do by age get stale. Brokers had rather talk of speculation, topers of politics or frothing ale, lawyers of fees, shoemakers of their leather, poets of themselves, women of one another. End of section 8. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Aidan Fitzgerald. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9, Anecdotes of Guerrilla Warfare. The strange exploits of these daring partisans, though true to the letter, are perfectly romantic, and the patient endurance, the deep artifice with which their objectives were effected, appear to be almost incredible. Persons whose ages and professions were best calculated to evade suspicion were invariably their chosen agents. The village priest was commonly a confederate of the neighboring guerrilla. The postmaster betrayed the intelligence that reached him in his office. The fairest peasant of Estremadura would tempt the thoughtless soldier with her beauty, and decoy him within the range of the bullet. And even childhood was frequently and successfully employed in leading the unsuspecting victim into some pass or ambuscade, where the knife or musket closed his earthly career. In every community, however fierce and lawless, different gradations of good and evil will be discovered, and nothing could be more opposite than the feelings and actions of some of the guerrillas and their leaders. Many of these desperate bands were actuated in every enterprise by a love of bloodshed and spoliation, and their own countrymen suffered as heavily from their rapacity as their enemies from their swords. Others took the field from nobler motives. An enthusiastic attachment to their country and religion aroused them into vengeance against a tyranny which had become insufferable. Every feeling but ardent patriotism was forgotten. Private and dearer ties were snapped asunder. Homes and wives and children were abandoned. Privations that appear almost incredible were patiently endured until treachery delivered them to the executioner, or in some wild attempt they were overpowered by numbers and died resisting to the last. Dreadful as the retaliation was which French cruelty and oppression had provoked, the guerrilla vengeance against domestic treachery was neither less certain or less severe. To collect money or supplies for the invaders, convey information, conceal their movements, and not betray them when opportunity occurred, was death to the offender. Sometimes the delinquent was brought with considerable difficulty and risk before a neighboring tribunal, and executed with all the formalities of justice. But generally a more summary vengeance was exacted, and the traitor was sacrificed upon the spot. In these cases, neither calling nor age was respected. If found false to his country, the sanctity of his order was no protection to the priest. The daughter of the collector of Almagro, for professing attachment to the usurper, was stabbed to the heart by Urena. And a secret correspondence between the wife of Alcalde of Brihuega and the French general in the next command, having been detected by an intercepted dispatch, the wretched woman, by order of Juan Martin Diaz, the Epicanado, was dragged by a guerrilla party from her house, her head shaven, her denuded person tarred and feathered, and disgracefully exhibited in the public marketplace. And she was then put to death amid the execrations of her tormentors. Nor was there any security for a traitor, even were his residence in the capital or almost within the camp of the enemy. One of the favorites of Joseph Bonaparte, Don Jose Rigo, was torn from his home in the suburbs of Madrid, while celebrating his wedding by the Epicanado, and hanged in the square of Cadiz. The usurper himself on 2 occasions narrowly escaped from this desperate partisan. Dining at Almeda, some 2 leagues distant from the capital, with one of the generals of division, their hilarity was suddenly interrupted by the unwelcome intelligence that the Epicanado was at hand, and nothing but a hasty retreat preserved the pseudo-king from the capture. On another occasion he was surprised upon the Guadalajara road, and so rapid was the guerrilla movement, so determined their pursuit, that before the French could be succored by the garrison of Madrid, 40 of the royal escort were sabred between Torrejon and El Molar. A war of extermination raged, and on both sides blood flowed in torrents. One act of cruelty was as promptly answered by another, and a French decree ordering that every Spaniard taken in arms should be executed appeared to be a signal to the guerrillas to exclude from mercy every enemy who fell into their hands. The French had shown the example. The junta were denounced, their houses burned, their wives and children driven to the woods. If prisoners received quarter in the field, if they fell lame upon the march, or the remotest chance of a rescue appeared, they were shot like dogs. Others were butchered in the towns, their bodies left rotting on the highways, and their heads exhibited on poles. That respect which even the most depraved of men usually pay to female honor was shamefully disregarded, and more than one Spaniard, like the postmaster of Medina, was driven to the most desperate courses by the violation of a wife and the murder of child. It would be sickening to describe the horrid scenes which mutual retaliations produced. Several of the Epicanado's followers, who were surprised in the mountains of Guadarrama, were nailed to the trees and left there to expire, slowly by hunger and thirst. To the same trees, before a week elapsed, a similar number of French soldiers were affixed by the guerrillas. 2 of the inhabitants of Madrid, who were suspected of communicating with the brigand, as the French termed the armed Spaniards, were tried by court-martial and executed at their own door. The next morning 6 of the garrison were seen hanging from the walls beside the high road. Some females related to the Pararea, surnamed the Medico, had been abused most scandalously by the escort of a convoy who had seized them in the wood, and in return the guerrilla leader drove into an armada 80 Frenchmen and their officers, set fire to the thatch, and burned them to death, or shot them in their endeavors to leave the blazing chapel. Such were the dreadful enormities a system of retaliations caused. These desperate adventures were commanded by men of the most dissimilar professions. All were distinguished by some sobriquet, and these were of the most opposite descriptions. Among the leaders were friars and physicians, cooks and artisans, while some were characterized by a deformity, and others named after the form of their waistcoat or hat. Worse epithets described many of the minor chiefs. Truculence and spoliation obtained them titles. And strange as it may appear, the most ferocious band that invested Biscay was commanded by a woman named Martina. So indiscriminating and unrelenting was this female monster in her murder of friends and foes, that Mina was obligated to direct her force against her. She was surprised with the greater portion of her banditti, and the whole were shot upon the spot. Of all the guerrilla leaders, the 2 Minas were the most remarkable for their daring, their talents, and their successes. The younger, Xavier, had a short career, but nothing could be more chivalrous and romantic than many of the incidences that marked it. His band amounted to 1,000, and with this force he kept Navarre, Biscay, and Aragon in confusion, intercepted convoys, levied contributions, plundered the custom houses, and harassed the enemy incessantly. The villagers were obligated to furnish rations for his troops, and the French convoys supplied him with money and ammunition. His escapes were often marvelous. He swam flooded rivers deemed impassable, and climbed precipice Heathrow untraversed by human foot. Near Estella, he was forced by numbers to take refuge on a lofty rock. The only accessible side he defended till nightfall, when lowering himself and followers by a rope, he brought off his party with scarcely the loss of a man. This was among his last exploits, for when reconnoitering by moonlight in the hope of capturing a valuable convoy, he fell unexpectedly into the hands of an enemy's patrol. Prescribed by the French as a bandit, it was surprising that his life was spared, but his loss to the guerrillas was regarded as a great misfortune. While disputing as to the choice of a leader, where so many aspired to a command to which each offered an equal claim, an adventurer worthy to succeed their lost chief was happily discovered in his uncle, the elder Mina. Educated as a husbandman and scarcely able to read or write, the new leader had lived in great retirement, until the junta's call to arms induced him to join his nephew's band. He reluctantly succeeded to the general wish to become Xavier's Menina's successor, but when he assumed the command, his firm and daring character was rapidly developed. Echeverria, with a force following, had started as a rival chief, but Mina surprised him, had 3 of his subordinates shot with their leader, and united the remainder of the band with his own, although he narrowly escaped from becoming a victim to the treachery of a comrade. The prompt and severe justice with which he visited the offender effectually restrained other adventurers from making any similar attempt. The traitor was a sergeant of his own, who from the bad expression of his face had received among the companions the sobriquet of Malcarado. Discontented with the new commander, he determined to betray him to the enemy, and consecrated measures with Panetia, whose brigade was near the villages of Robres, to surprise the guerrilla chieftain in his bed. Partial success attended this treacherous attempt, but Mina defended himself desperately with the bar of the door, and kept the French at bay till Gestre, his chosen comrade, assisted him to escape. The guerrilla rallied his followers, repulsed the enemy, took Malcarado, and shot him instantly, while the village erred and 3 alcaldes implicated in the treacherous design were hanged side by side upon a tree, and their houses razed to the ground. An example of severity like this gave confidence to his own followers, and exacted submission from the peasantry. Everywhere Mina had a faithful spy. Every movement of the enemy was reported, and if a village magistrate received a regulation from a French commandant, it was communicated to the guerrilla chief with due dispatch, or woe to the alcalde that neglected it. Nature had formed Mina for the service to which he had devoted himself. His constitution was equal to every privation and fatigue, and his courage was of that prompt and daring character that no circumstance, however sudden and disheartening, could overcome. Careless as to dress or food, he depended for a change of linen on the capture of French baggage, or any accidental supply, and for days he would exist upon a few biscuits, or anything which chanced through in his road. He guarded carefully against surprise, slept with the dagger and pistols in his girdle, and such were his active habits that he rarely took more than 2 hours of repose. The mountain caverns were the depositories of his ammunition and plunder, and in a mountain fastness he established a hospital for his wounded, to which they were carried in litters across the heights and placed in perfect safety until their cure could be completed. Gaming and plunder were prohibited, and even love forbidden, lest the guerrilla might be too communicative to the object of his affection, and any of his chieftain's secrets should transpire. Of the minor chiefs, many strange and chivalrous adventures were on record. The daring plans, often tried and generally successful, and the hairbreadth escapes of several are almost beyond belief. No means, however, repugnant to the laws of modern warfare were unemployed, while the ingenuity with which intelligence of a hostile movement was transmitted, the artifice with which an enemy was delayed until he could be surrounded or surprised, appear incredible. Of individual veracity, a few instances will be sufficient. At the execution of an alcalde and his son at Mondragon, the old man boasted that 200 French had perished by their hands, and the chaleco, Francis Moreno, and a record of his services boasts of his having waited for a cavalry patrol in a ravine, and by the discharge of a huge blunderbuss, loaded nearly to the muzzle, dislocated his own shoulder, and killed or wounded 9 of the French. The same chief presented to Villafranca a rich booty of plate and quicksilver, but he added to the gift a parcel of ears cut from the prisoners whom on that occasion he had slaughtered. Profiting by the anarchy that reigned in this afflicted country, wretches under political excuses committed murder and devastation on a scale of frightful magnitude. One, pretending to be a functionary of junta, made Ladrada a scene of bloodshed. By night his victims were dispatched, and to the disgrace of women, his wife was more sanguinary than himself. Castanos at length arrested their blood-stained career, and Pedrazula was hanged and beheaded, and Maria, his infamous confederate, garroted. Castile was overrun by banditti, and one gang, destroyed by a guerrilla chief named Juan Abrif, had accumulated plunder, principally in specie, amounting in value to 500,000 reales. One of the band, when captured by the French, to save his life, discovered the secret and offered to lead a party to the place where the treasure was deposited. His proposal was accepted. An alguazil with an escort of cavalry proceeded to the wood of Villa Viciosa, and there booty was found worth more than the value affixed to it by the deserter. Returning in unsuspecting confidence, the party were drawn into an ambuscade by the medico, who had been acquainted with the expedition, and of the escort and officials, with the exception of 5 who managed to escape, every one was butchered without mercy. Such were the Spaniards, who made themselves remarkable for patriotism and endurance, surpassing courage and unmitigated cruelty. End of section 9.
Section 10 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 10, Interesting Incident. General Dearborn, writing of the ceremonies on the morning of the Bunker Hill celebration, says, "When I entered the room at Concert Hall on the morning of the 17th, where the members of the Society of Cincinnati were to assemble for the purpose of joining in the procession, I found several old soldiers of the Revolution who had come there by mistake instead of going to the State House. While in conversation with one of the members of the society, I was surprised to hear the notes of a fife in the room, and turning in the direction whence they proceeded, discovered an aged man seated among the old soldiers who was performing on that instrument. I immediately went and took a seat beside him and listened until he had concluded playing Washington's March, when the following conversation ensued. Were you a fifer in the Revolutionary Army? I was. In what corps? Nixon's regiment and Nixon's brigade. How long did you serve? 3 years. I was in the campaigns in the Jerseys, and I was present at the execution of Major Andre. How old are you? I am in my 83rd year. Where do you live? In Springfield. What is your name? Thaddeus Perry. He then played Yankee Doodle, and remarkably well. He had a grandson with him, who appeared to be 10 or 12 years old, and who had accompanied his grandfather, apparently to take care of him, as the veteran was feeble and so deaf as to render it difficult to converse with him. How remarkable that after the lapse of time which had intervened since the close of the Revolution, there should still be heard in the Society of Cincinnati, on the 68th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, a fifer of Washington's army playing the march of that illustrious patriot and the spirit-stirring national air of Yankee Doodle, which had so often cheered the American camp during the glorious struggle for liberty and national independence." End of section 10. Read by Alan Mapstone.
Section 11 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wizard Doctor. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 11. Singular Instance of Sudden Death. A drunken coal heaver is related to have fallen from a wagon, been taken up and carried to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He was stripped, and the surgeon examined him, but no injury could be discovered. Still, he said he could not rise up in the bed. Mr. Abernethy was called in, but this celebrated surgeon could make nothing of the case, and directed that he should be washed thoroughly clean, and a barber procured to shave him. About an hour after, a message was brought that the man had instantaneously, while undergoing the operation of shaving, died. The barber said he appeared to be well, and was talking to him one instant, and the next was a dead man. "I had hold of him," he said, "by the nose, and I did but turn his head very gently to use the razor when he, without breathing or a sigh, went off." Abernethy turned to the young students and told them this was a case for study, saying there was a cause for the man's death, that the following morning he would open the body and find it out. At the same time he asked the students to think of the case, and tell him in the morning their opinions of what might be the cause. One of the students suggested that a vertebral bone was fractured, and that as the barber turned his head to shave him, a splinter penetrated the spinal cord. Abernethy immediately coincided in this opinion, and they then cut down the back, and discovered a small piece of fractured bone, not bigger than half a pin, which had penetrated the spine. Taking the corpse by the nose, they observed, as they turned the head one way, the splinter came out, and as they turned it the contrary, it entered the vital cord. The problem was now at once solved, and a striking illustration furnished how little it takes to stop the great machine of life in man. End of section 11.
Section 12 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 12, Our Table. The Rover. We see by the papers that Mr. and Mrs. Seba Smith are to be the editors of this weekly magazine. Of course, with such able navigators, the Rover must make pleasant voyages, but as she has never come athwart our house, we cannot say what manner of craft she is. If Captain Smith will come within hail, we will report him. Top your boom for down east, if you please. Portland Transcript. Schooner Transcript ahoy. Ah, Captain Isley, is that you? Glad to have a chance to speak ye. All's well aboard, I hope. I used to come in your wake sometimes, you know, when I was sailing in another craft. But I've been ashore so long, I didn't know as I should hardly know ye, if I fell in with ye. But it wasn't so. I knew the cut of your jib the moment you came in sight. Your craft's held her own remarkably well these stormy times. I don't see but she looks as trim and bright as she did the day she was first launched, and that is extraordinary good luck, considering how many have gone to the bottom in the same time, and how many have burst their bilers, and how many have been sucked out of their tracks by undercurrents till they were smashed upon the rocks, and how many are still shivering in the wind. By the way, Captain, let me correct a little bit of a mistake that you've been led into by some of the papers that reported my taking charge of the Rover. Mrs. Seba Smith isn't one of the editors, as you may see by looking at the regular ship's papers, but still it is true that lady accompanies us on the voyage, for having already been with me on so long a cruise, acting generally as chief mate, and keeping watch with me all kinds of weather, fair and foul, I couldn't have the heart to leave her behind when starting on a new voyage, could I? You know how 'tis, Captain. One is apt to get attached to a mate that's been with 'em a good while, and hates to discharge 'em, though sometimes it is true they would kick 'em ashore, and glad of the chance, the first port they come into. But since the papers made some mistake about the terms of this lady's shipping, I may as well state in what capacity she goes this cruise. She doesn't go as chief mate, nor steward, nor bottle washer, and she don't go before the mast, but the fact is she goes as a sort of a passenger. She goes for the pleasure of the voyage, but she works her passage as Paddy did on the canal boat, who paid his fare by walking on the side track and leading the horse, and declared at the same time, you know, that if it wasn't for the name of it, he would about as leaves go afoot. Howsomever, I don't intend she shall make so much of a toil of the pleasure as Paddy did, but just pull and haul the light sails a little, merely for amusement, when she feels inclined to. Although she won't work as a regular hand, I've no doubt she will make herself handy aboard, and sometimes perhaps help me right up the log. I find the crew are pleased and work the better for having her aboard, for she has a kind of a winning way at telling stories that they like very much to hear, and when the sails are set, and everything is hauled taut, and we are under easy way before a clever breeze, they'll gather round her and sit by the hour and listen to the pleasant yarns she'll reel off just as easy as I can reel up the log line. And then if I get tired with the toils of the day, or fevered about the weather, or perplexed with the crew, if I can only see her, morning, noon, and night, standing in the companion way, and looking kindly upon me, why, Cap'n, I tell ye what 'tis, it gives me heart again, and makes things look brighter. But I see I'm getting out of speaking distance. A pleasant cruise to ye. Goodbye, Cap'n. End of section 12.
Section 13 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Aidan Fitzgerald. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 13, Passing Away, Passing Away. Verily, we all do fade as a leaf. One generation passeth away, another generation cometh. Man cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth as a shadow, and continueth not. Thou prevailest for ever against him, and he passeth. Thou changest his countenance, and he sendest him away. These passages were brought to mind with striking and peculiar force a few days since, when stepping into a reading room and glancing at one of the dailies, I beheld the leading editorial column filled with obituary notices of 3 New England men of note and distinction, 2 of whom were my personal acquaintances, and the fame of the other made him the cherished acquaintance of all his countrymen. This last was the first on the list. It was Alston, Washington Alston, the painter and the poet. He died at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the 64th year of his age. He was a native of South Carolina, was educated at Cambridge, afterward spent some years in Europe, and on his return to his country he settled at Cambridge, where he resided till his decease. He was twice married, first to a sister of the late Dr. Channing. His second wife, now his widow, is a sister of Richard H. Donna, Esquire of Boston. While Mr. Alston was in London many years ago, he published a small volume of poems, which gave him an honorable rank as a poet. And about a year ago, he published a thrilling tale entitled Monaldi, which proved him to be a prose writer of great power. It is his pencil, however, more than his pen, that has given him a high reputation, and will carry his name a long way down the stream of time, side by side with West and other masters of the art. His great work was still on his hands at the time of his decease, and it is feared has been left unfinished. The subject is Belsar's Feast. The artist had been engaged upon it something like 20 years, and during all that time it is said no person but himself has ever seen it. The second obituary which met my eye in the same column was that of John Holmes of Maine, for many years a senator in the Congress of the United States, and at the time of his death, United States District Attorney for the state of Maine. Mr. Holmes died at Portland, aged 71. He acquired a sudden and mind-spread reputation through the country during the late war with England. He was a representative in the legislature of Massachusetts from Alfred, in the province of Maine. When party spirit at the time in the old Bay State ran so high against the measures of the general government as to make it totter to its foundation, John Holmes, an unknown lawyer from Alfred, rose up in their legislature in the midst of the opposition, like a strong man armed, and poured upon them such a torrent of sarcasm and keen inventive as in some measure to check their operations, and to help strengthen the arm of the government. His speeches on that occasion were felt almost like electricity through the country. They were everywhere copied and read, and were the general topic of conversation. Not that they were so very remarkable for what they actually contained, as they were for the circumstances which elicited them, and the peculiar position in which the orator showed himself to the country. Soon after the war, Mr. Holmes took an active part in the measures to separate Maine from Massachusetts. He was a leading member in the conventions of the people on the subject, and a leading member of the convention, which after the separation formed the state constitution, and it was with his pen, more than any other, which gave shape to that instrument. Mr. Holmes was twice married. His second wife was the daughter of General Knox, of Revolutionary memory, and for several of his last years he was resided at the old Knox Mansion House, a beautiful estate in Thompson, near the mouth of the Penobscot Bay. Glancing along down the same column of the same daily, the eye fell upon the third obituary. It was that of John Abbott, late professor of languages at Bowdoin College, Brunswick, Maine. He died at Andover, Massachusetts, aged 84. Uncle Johnny, as the students ever called him. Good old man. Is he gone? He was one of the fathers of the college, and the college was his beloved, his only child, upon which he bestowed his largest sympathies, and over whose welfare he watched until his dying day, with all a parent's fondness. The good old man had never any other family. He was the first professor of languages in the institution, and when from age and ability he was compelled to resign that office, he still acted as treasurer of the college for many years. The notice of his death which met our view called him a gentleman of the old school. He was indeed so, and one of the most favorable specimens. Gentlemanly, courteous, and benevolent, he possessed too kind a heart to rule the wild spirits of young college students, and oftentimes have our sympathies been pained at witnessing the quiet meekness and unsuspecting good nature with which he bore the roguish tricks put upon him. Many long years have passed since those days, but still, methinks, I can see the blending of modesty and dignity that rested upon his features, as he tripped quietly into the recitation room, with his surtout buttoned to the throat, and taking his seat in the corner, and throwing one knee mechanically over the other, showing his knee-buckles and silk hose to good advantage. He would cast a benevolent look around upon the class, and commence with a slight stammer, Smith, construe. And then he was so kind if any of us got screwed in our recitations. He never failed to help us out of the difficulty in the most benevolent manner possible. Good old man. We little thought so long ago that he would continue with us until this present, for even then old age was creeping fast and heavily upon him, and a crook was in back, and a melancholy crack in his laugh. But he was permitted to live to a good old age, and now is gathered, like a shock of corn fully ripe, to sleep with his fathers. He was a life of usefulness, patriotism, and virtue. He did service in the Revolutionary War and made one of the army that captured Burgoyne. Peace be to his memory. Good friends and kind patrons, we have much to thank you for. True, we have encountered some storms, and have met some dishonest foes, but we've had good cheer for one, and plenty of shot for the other. Some shot have struck below the waistline. A fair wind now, though, and a flowing sheet. End of Section 13. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 18. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree.